Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Jonathan Brinson. I'm a charity partner here at BDB Pitmans, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's discussion. For those of you who don't know our practice, we look after not-for-profit organizations of every description and at every stage of the life cycle, from creation and thereafter across the full range of operational and governance activities. But in addition, we like to bring people together to learn from experts and peers on key issues affecting the sector. And perhaps there's no issue of greater importance than the one we will be discussing today. So I'll be hosting the discussion, and shortly you'll be hearing from our panel of expert speakers on today's topic. I should let you know that the event is being recorded, and so if you're not able to watch the full discussion, you'll be able to pick it up from our website afterwards. So in the next hour, we're going to be exploring how philanthropy and impact investment can engage with the question of climate change, which is timely given the quite terrifying warnings set out in the recent IPCC report, although they are nothing new in and of themselves. Not to mention that we have COP26 coming up in November in Glasgow. So there's going to be a lot of ground to cover in the next hour, and we hope to include some Q&A as well. So please feel free to make use of the chat function throughout, and we'll look to pick up some of those questions hopefully towards the end. But to kick things off, I will introduce our amazing panel, whom you will learn more about during the course of the discussion. But in brief, and I would ask our panel to turn on the cameras as I introduce them. We have Sophie Marple, founder and trustee of Gower Street, and Sophie will be telling us a little bit about how she refocused her philanthropic energy to support climate solutions. Hello, Sophie. We have Juja Marmari from Impatience Earth, and they provide strategic advice and support for donors and organizations seeking to address the climate crisis. We have Tessa Khan. Tessa is an international climate change and human rights lawyer. Tessa co-founded the Climate Litigation Network and is now director of Uplift, the ambition of which is to transition the UK away from its dependency on fossil fuels. And last, but by no means least, we have Jamie Broderick, who sits on the board of the Impact Investing Institute, having had an illustrious career prior to that in asset management. Hello, Jamie. So thank you to all our panelists for joining. And if this was live now, I'm sure we'd be receiving a nice warm round of applause, but we'll just have to live without that, I'm afraid. So before we dive right in, it's perhaps a good idea to set the scene. So the Paris Agreement was adopted by 196 countries at the end of 2015, committing to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees. So Tessa, given that we have this legally binding agreement, surely we have absolutely nothing to worry about.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks so much for convening this very interesting discussion. Unfortunately, I have bad news about our progress towards meeting the Paris Agreement's goals, temperature goals that you've outlined, which, as you said, is aspiring to limit warming to a critical threshold of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial average temperatures. So basically, the scale of work that we have to do to reach those goals is confirmed by a number of different metrics. So to begin with, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the most authoritative global scientific body on climate change, confirmed a couple of years ago in one of their reports that we need to halve greenhouse gas emissions globally by 2030 if we're going to meet that 1.5 degree target. And unfortunately, year on year, we've continued to increase greenhouse gas emissions, with the exception of last year when, as a result of the economic slowdown caused by COVID, there was a small dip in emissions, but we've bounced back from that and are continuing to move in exactly the opposite direction to the one that we need to go in if we're going to halve our emissions. Another way of thinking about this is to look at the projected level of warming associated with existing climate policies globally. and the assessment of the impact of those climate policies and emissions reductions policies are that we will reach warming of somewhere between 2.7 and 3.1 degrees, which would be beyond catastrophic for the world and for societies globally. Another way of looking at this is to think about the volume of fossil fuels that we can produce if we're going to meet that 1.5 degree target. And the UN's Environment Programme recently published a report called the Production Gap Report that confirms that globally we are on track to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels than we can burn if we're going to meet the 1.5 degree target. So I think that gives you a pretty comprehensive picture from a number of different angles of the direction of travel. Of course, on the other hand, as I'm sure many of you will know, we've had, a number of net zero targets announced by governments and businesses. But the real challenge there is that because of the physics of climate change, which is that it's the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions that matter, what really matters is how much we emit in the short term. So we can pledge to, zero out our emissions in 30 years' time. But if we blow our remaining budget of greenhouse gases associated with our temperature targets in the next 10 years, then what we do in 30 years just won't matter. And that's where we're severely lacking, is in those shorter term targets and more importantly, policies and programs. Equally, you've probably heard that there are, the pace at which the uptake of renewable energy and the cost of renewable energy that's all moving in the right direction. But unfortunately, that alone is not going to be enough. We can't just transition to renewables. We need to desperately get off fossil fuels, which is why that's what Uplift is really focused on. But that's I think, the full picture.
Thank you, Tessa, I think, for that. I mean, given the sense of urgency that Tessa's just described and the catastrophic impact of an overheating planet, Judith, why do you think only 2% of global philanthropic giving is dedicated to climate change? Is it fair to say that the philanthropic community has been somewhat hesitant about wrapping their arms around this issue?
Yeah, I think every time I hear that statistic, it still makes me shiver a little bit that such little money is going into climate, especially, in the past few years when we've seen the climate crisis play out, on our front doorstep in many places. I think there are several different reasons why climate philanthropy hasn't taken off in the way that it should. And these are things that come up in the conversations that we have at Impatience Earth with donors who are new to the space, maybe haven't considered climate philanthropy before. I think there's an assumption that it's funded already, that there are big players in this space who are giving billions of dollars into climate action, and that statistic just proves that that's not true. And I think you have a few stories making the headlines, but actually it's on the whole extremely underfunded still. I think people tend to think that, if they're giving smaller amounts, that it's not going to make a difference. And actually, we've found that it makes huge impact, especially if you're able to fund more grassroots solutions or organizations in the global south or working on climate justice issues. We often encounter people thinking it's too late already. We're actually in this really amazing time where it's right now that it matters. It's not 10 years from now. 10 years will be too late. But right now, money you put into climate philanthropy can make a real difference. And I think for most donors, it's a sense of fear and a sense of being overwhelmed. Tessa outlined the trajectory that we're on, and it is scary to think about. But I think philanthropy provides a really hopeful tool to be thinking about the climate crisis, because it is part of the solutions. And so one of the things that we do at Impatience Earth is really help donors, build their confidence and their knowledge in terms of the climate crisis and climate philanthropy, so action doesn't feel so scary. Because I think it's a very human reaction when you have something like the climate crisis or any crisis that you're confronted with, to sort of want to just run away and not think about it and not confront it straight on. And so I think it's really about creating spaces where people can learn and feel empowered to take action, rather than feel like, they're not going to make a difference, or it's just too scary to be able to step into.
Thank you. I mean, Sophie, can you pick that story up and just talk us through how you came to climate philanthropy and how you came to appreciate that you could make a difference with relatively small amounts of money?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I mean, I agree very much with what Julia was saying. I think it's. I mean, I think us as a foundation, we were pushing it away, and it was interesting because you said before about, you know, there's this sense of urgency. You know, is there really a sense of urgency around it? I think you hear these, you know, you hear these years like 2030, 2050, and we can all sit in our comfortable green England and think, oh no, it's all right, it's not affecting me. Is it even when there are massive fires going on and you can see it all happening, but it feels so distant. It's still, because the way the rhetoric is, it's, you know, it feels distant. But I think for us, we pushed away for a long time, but it's not like we didn't know. And then all these things came together in about 2018, where we'd begun to fund around climate, but we suddenly sped up, because I think Extinction Rebellion actually coming on the scene was massive. I think towards the end, and then you had the IPCC report came out, and you had books on the bookshelf like The Uninhabitable Earth. And I think all of these things together made us think, you know, we've just got to get, if we're not going to do it, who is? And I think that's the question as a philanthropist you've got to start asking yourself. Because if you're not in climate, who do you expect to be in there? And I think, you know, also if you look at the sector, there's so much that requires risk capital to actually work. So all of the legislation, all of the stuff that Tessa does, it can't happen without philanthropic, without the risk capital. And we have found that you know, there is this idea that billions are going to, there isn't. And, you know, you find these small organizations with these incredible, passionate and committed people who really found their gap. And I'm going to, you know, I'd say Tessa was definitely one of them, really found the gap where they can really make a difference. And you back them with small amounts of money, and you give them your confidence, because you're like, I know you can do this, and you're with them on the journey. And you know, we have for a portfolio of about 25 organizations that we've funded in the last 2 years with 30,000 or under, and I would say they're all doing brilliant work. So yeah, there is a real opportunity there.
That's great, and that's great to hear. And I'd love to, if we had the time, ask you follow-up questions about those organizations that you're funding within that portfolio. But I think it's important to, I think, address one of the key barriers that sort of I see quite a bit as a charity lawyer, is that philanthropists often set out with a very specific social charitable aim in mind, whether that be health or social justice. So in other words, they don't view themselves as a climate donor. So Julia, also if indeed, that being so, can you just talk us through how it is that the climate cause is an intersectional problem?
To be honest, it's the most exciting thing about climate philanthropy is that it doesn't exist in a silo, and it doesn't mean sort of turning your back on whatever you've traditionally set out to fund at all. And I think you can think really creatively about the ways that it intersects. I think on a really high level, and not to be all doom and gloom, but the reality is any funding you're putting in anywhere else is not going to make a difference in 30 years time if we don't have a planet that we can live on. I think that's like a really basic way that it intersects with other issue areas. But I think if you look at it in a more nuanced lens, I mean, we talk all the time to people who have been health funders or education funders and help them identify how what their funding might contribute to the climate crisis. For example, the health industry is a big contributor to the climate crisis, but also how where their funding is a solution in itself. So I love the story of, you know, one of the UK's biggest health funders became one of the UK's biggest climate funders because they recognised that air pollution, you know, directly impacts public health, and therefore they're working on a climate issue without even changing their charitable objectives because it's still a health issue. When it comes to education, and Sophie can speak more on this, you know, climate education is so necessary, not just for the next generation, but for everyone on this planet to understand sort of how we can be contributing to solving the climate crisis. And that means that you don't have to stop being an education funder to become a climate funder. And actually, I'll hand that over to you, Sophie, because you can speak a bit more to how you found that intersection.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. I think the word that we've heard quite a lot is overwhelming. Often as a philanthropist comes in, you find this very overwhelming sector. And if you are already funding, because you're right, Jonathan, you know, often we are in the, you know, we fund in education, and we definitely funded in education for 12 years before we actually we pivoted into climate. But through that pivot, where we felt comfortable funding at the beginning was in education around climate. And also one of the markets that we fund in is Ghana. And so we do a lot of education funding in Ghana, but now we also do a lot of climate funding in Ghana. And we've used the same contacts, and it's just made the transition so much smoother and easier to understand, and also you just feel more comfortable with it, and it gives you this sort of first step in to then keep moving forward. And I think that's the thing that with all of this, the most important thing is you get in there and you start doing it. And however you do it, just get on with it, you know. And so if it's in through an intersection that you understand, just go that way. Or if you just want to take a plunge and you just want to go straight into just go that way. But just start, because the 2030, the 2050, you've got to organize, you've got to ignore those numbers. You've got to start now, like the government should be too.
I think we're already having one of the key takeaways from this session. Can I just come back to something that you touched on before, Sophie, and that's climate activism, because again, we see now that Extinction Rebellion is out and about, keeping climate on the agenda through protest and civil disturbance. But how important, I mean, I was aiming this at Tessa, but Sophie, Sarah, you, sorry, Sophie, so if you please jump in. How important is that type of activism in beating the drum, and how does it sit with philanthropy, do you think?
That's a question for me.
Sure.
I can kick off, or you.
Sophie, go ahead.
So I had to say that it was Extinction Rebellion that really was the lever that got us into philanthropy work. And in fact, one of the first, the most inspirational funding I think I've ever done is I crowdfunded £40,000 from other philanthropists to put into the rebellion in 2019. And that, you know, no one in the climate sector can deny the effect that 2019 April rebellion had. You know, it was just transformatory. And I would liken them to the battering ram. They went in there and they were absolutely relentless. And what we all did then is we came behind them going, oh, now we'll do this and now we'll do that. And they gave us permission. I mean, I was there too, but I also felt it gave me permission to do stuff that I had conversations after that I had never had before. It just gave me that confidence and permission. And I would say they are absolutely necessary. And what I love about it, they're not out there to be liked. They're out there to get a message across. And I, as far as I'm concerned, so I will keep funding them to get that message across.
Yeah, I think I'd just echo what Sophie said about ultimately, you know, love them or hate them, how effective undeniably Extinction Rebellion's tactics have been, especially in precipitating a declaration of climate emergency and the UK government's net zero target. All of that followed that period of rebellion, together, of course, with the youth climate strikes and the IPCC's report. But I think, you know, there's pretty much consensus around the role that Extinction Rebellion's actions played in catalyzing that progress. I think it's also important to take a kind of historical view of the role that this sort of protest and direct action has played in pretty much every single movement for transformative political change. I mean, it just doesn't happen without people getting on the streets, whether that's for racial justice or social justice. And it's because, you know, it's a tactic of last resort. You know, people feel like they've exhausted conventional democratic processes, voting and lobbying their MPs. And, you know, this is what it comes to when it feels like it's an emergency and, you know, you're desperate to do something. So I think, you know, whether or not it's to everyone's taste, and I know it's not, it's important, I think, to appreciate the very important role that it does in creating a sense of kind of moral crisis and provoking a reaction that inevitably escalates the issue up the sort of social and political agenda.
No, I think that's really good points. And I think Sophie's point about it acting as a kind of vanguard behind which sort of philanthropy can sort of go behind and maybe do the sort of more delicate work. I think that's a really important point, that they sort of need to clear the path. Jamie, you've been really patient, so I think I'll just turn to talking about the other side of the equation now, because many foundations are of course funded by their endowments, and it's here that we've seen perhaps the most significant changes of late, with massive inflows into ESG funds where companies are judged on environmental, social, or corporate governance factors. But Jamie, in your view, how important is it for charities and foundations to focus on this side of the equation? Would you say it's potentially even more important than anything which they achieve, say, on the grant making side?
Well, it's an interesting question, Jonathan. And I think one of the things that really intrigues me is the fact that company directors in the UK are required by law, Section 172 if you care, to take into account of the impact of their operations on society and the environment. How odd is it that neither pensions nor charities are subject to the same requirement, even though both are beneficiaries of the public purse through tax privileges? So it's kind of an odd, it feels like there's something missing here from charity endowments. But I guess the way to think about it is, if you're distributing 5% of your assets each year in grants, say, then you have the other 95% of your endowment that's being invested. So the question really charity endowments should be asking themselves is, why would you deploy 95% of your investments undoing the good that you're doing with the 5% in grant activity? And just to help you a little bit with the arithmetic. So I think that it's hard to claim, I mean, you asked me whether you can do as much with the endowment as you can with grants. You know, it's a difficult question to answer, but let's just look at the arithmetic. If the money that you're granting is 5%, the money that you're investing is 95%, that's 19 times as much money. So if that 19 times as much money is funding things like social housing and social enterprises and environmental solutions, then it sure could do an awful lot of good. I don't know how you would ever calibrate whether the good that you do with the 95% does as much good as the grant activity. But say it was approximately the same, just say, then what that means is that you've effectively doubled your ability to do good in the world between your grant activity and your investing activity. And you can't put an endowment entirely into your charitable objects. If you're a dog and cat charity, you can't invest in dogs and cats. But I think in terms of doing good for society and the environment, the thought that you could do is almost as much or nearly as much or something comparable with your endowment as you are with your grant activity means you're basically doubling your grant, doubling the amount of good you do for society. So I think it's really important for charity trustees to be thinking about what they could be doing with their endowments. And they really should be thinking about that arithmetic a little bit.
Yeah, and I would agree. And of course, charities are sort of subject in the wider context about operating for the public benefit. And obviously it tends to be focused on outputs and activities. But I mean,
I would extend that to, I mean, if you're operating for public benefit, then I would extend that to your full operations, including the operation of your endowment. And I don't know why that isn't more explicit in people's.
Well, indeed. And so I suppose my wider question is, do we feel that, almost in regulatory terms, but certainly in the court of public opinion, that charities and foundations should be consistent in their approach? So going back to Extinction Rebellion, is it fair for them to be critical of the Science Museum for taking sponsorship money from Shell in relation to their CO2 extraction exhibition, or for big foundations generally to still be investing in fossil fuels, or for Jeff Bezos, self-proclaimed climate philanthropist, to be strapping himself to a rocket? Is there a lack of consistency in the sector that should be called out? Sophie, I'm sure you've got a thought on that.
I would say yes, there's definitely lack of consistency. I think there's also a lack of understanding. I think, you know, there's a lot of ignorance around it. I think also there is, oh, I think I might have frozen. There's also, I think I might have frozen there. There's a lack of understanding. I think also, you know, with some quite big foundations, I know the people who work on the foundations from a philanthropic point of view, they can't get anywhere near the endowment. They're told, no, that's not for you. You know, we do this bit, we give you the money to be able to do it. So I think, and I absolutely love what Jamie just said. In fact, I wrote that down and she'll use that in the future. But one of the first things that we did as we moved into this space, and to be fair, we were doing this already, but we did take a very good look at our investment portfolio. It is not particularly easy to do, I have to be honest, to find really good solutions that that are not the greenwash, that they're not just like the most basic ESG, which is now heavily used as as a term, but you know, if you look behind the veil, you know, there's some very shady stuff going on in there. So I mean, to be really, really, you know, investigative about your investments is actually quite difficult to make sure they're all 100% for you. So, but we've done, I would say, what you've got to try and do is do your best, and I would say we've really tried to do our best and try to find the people doing innovative stuff, and you know. And people worry about the return. I think, you know, overall, where we put our money, we've got better returns, because ultimately it's about social need. But when you invest in like social change and social need, it's needed. It's actually needed. So that's where you will get, you know, there is safety in that.
I was just going to, I mean, I sort of think it's an unfair question, Jamie, to ask in the wake of that, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think the jury's still out on the question of whether 100% fossil fuel divestment is the best course of action for foundations, or indeed pension funds, as you mentioned earlier, worried about climate change to do?
Well, I think that the jury has given its verdict on that topic. And the fact of the matter is that divesting from fossil fuel company shares doesn't impact their access to capital. So why is that? Because when you divest from a oil company, you're giving your shares to somebody else. When you buy shares of an oil company, you're buying them from someone else. The company doesn't get more or less capital. And I think that's something that's broadly not understood. I think most people assume that when you invest in an oil company, you're giving them money. That is not the case. And when you divest from an oil company, you are losing the opportunity to influence them through shareholder engagement. So I think for a lot of people, and particularly foundations, they don't want to be associated with oil companies. They don't want to get revenue from oil companies. So on a values basis, that's a different question. I think that, you know, that's something for foundations to decide on their own. But from an economic standpoint, it doesn't do anything to an oil company other than you pass the shares on to somebody who cares slightly less than you do. And you can see even today when you've got oil companies divesting from, I mean, a lot of the oil companies are trying to improve their carbon emissions profile, so they're divesting from operations, tar sands, for example, complex, really dirty oil. They're divesting because they're making them very unpopular. They sell them to private equity and they disappear from the public view, and then they're no longer, or they sell them to a sovereign like Russia or China, and they disappear from public view and there's no way to influence them. So I think if you have an ethical objection to being associated with an oil company, then by all means, divest. But just so people need to understand that divesting doesn't deprive these companies of capital, any of them, not tobacco, not oil, not anything. And there has been a lot of success, I think, with shareholder engagement, which is that shareholders who then put pressure on Exxon and other people to improve their business practices. So from my perspective, from an economic perspective, I think divestment isn't a solution, but it may well be from a value standpoint.
Does anybody want to comment on that?
I think I've read kind of both sides. And I've also read the confidence side, of the fact that if you start divesting, there is an element of confidence, less confidence in the companies that then seek to get capital. But I absolutely agree with the point of that it can disappear from view, and that's actually much more dangerous. So it's sort of, yeah, it kind of goes both ways. I think I think my thought about investment is if you can positively invest, you know, particularly if you're getting new, you know, if there's new money coming into your foundation, that can be positively invested and thought about. It's a very different thing to think, because investment is a negative, you know, standpoint, but thinking actually, what can I do that's good with this money? Where can I put it that really will do some good? I think that's a very different perspective to take.
Yeah, I think investing in solutions is an option, and endowments should be thinking about that. In the listed market, which is where most of the investment happens, I think it's really down to shareholder engagement. And just to throw out, I mean, as you all know, Exxon was forced to take 3 climate activists on their board, and the reason was that a company called Engine Number 1 had shares in Exxon and put forward the proposal and succeeded in gathering enough other shareholders to support. Now, who knows whether those 3 board members are going to be effective, but that's quite a big move by a shareholder to influence an oil company to change its business practices.
Tessa, I have a feeling you want to come in.
I would love to. Yeah, I mean, I think just in terms of the overall impact of divestment, I think that, you know, the people who started the divestment movement understood its limitations in terms of actually limiting capital. But what it has, I think, done very effectively is undermine the social license of the fossil fuel industry, you know, to the extent that the fossil fuel industry is sort of in an existential crisis in terms of its ability to recruit from university campuses that have been at the forefront of the divestment movements. That's a really important, I think, objective of that movement that we also need to keep in mind. I think in terms of the argument that these assets will end up in the hands of private equity, and so ultimately that doesn't change things. I mean, I think there's analysis that shows that, you know, there are more fossil fuel assets than there are buyers in the private equity market on the one hand, and on the other, you know, private equity's model is to strip assets and get rid of them in the short term. They're not going to invest in the sorts of high risk projects. They don't have the know-how to keep projects, especially riskier oil and gas and fossil fuel projects, running for decades, which is what the much more established fossil fuel companies might do. So I think that, you know, we're yet to see the full impact of that sort of change of ownership from those assets. And I think that, you know, the Exxon shareholder revolt, which I know got a lot of, you know, was of much interest a few months ago when it happened. I think there's a very big difference between an activist investor and a climate activist. You know, the activist investors, engine number one, who ended up on the board of Exxon, you know, they have backgrounds in oil refining, and, you know, they're certainly not coming from the perspective, I think, that Exxon needs the sort of wholesale transformation of its business model that we know is actually needed, which is basically to sell off its fossil fuel extraction business. If we're listening to the science, I think ultimately they're concerned with the profitability of Exxon, and Exxon is the worst of, you know, the kind of, in terms of not having set a net zero target. It's not even paying lip service, really, I think, in the way that other fossil fuel companies are to what's required to address the climate crisis. So, you know, and Exxon's just announced new oil and gas drilling off the coast of Guyana. That would be its biggest oil and gas project so far. So I think, you know, there should be some skepticism about the extent to which shareholders actually do use their leverage, and what the limits of that leverage are, given the scale of transformation we need to see, especially within the fossil fuel sector.
Yeah, Tessa,
okay, Jamie, but if you could be brief, because I think we could get derailed by this question.
Okay. I would just say that I guess the example was more to show that I'm not claiming that engine number one are necessarily climate activists per se, but just the notion that you can small investment organizations can take a position and can disrupt the routine operations of companies. That's really what that's about. And there are other examples, you know, where we've done this recently this year in Tesco and HSBC and various other places. So it's just the concept of being able to influence companies by maintaining your shareholder position. That's really what this is about.
Let's move away from investments and let's come back to talking about philanthropy, because Jamie's touched on those ways in which charities can use their investments perhaps more effectively. But we talked earlier about some of the barriers to philanthropic engagement. And Julia and Sophie, can you just talk us through, perhaps in high-level terms, 2 or 3 areas where focused philanthropic money can potentially have the biggest impact?
I'm always a little bit hesitant in answering this question, because I think a lot of people are like, okay, so you've convinced me that climate is where I need to be giving my dollars to, now just tell me where. And I think, as overwhelming as the climate crisis is, the climate solution space is equally as overwhelming, because there are so many different avenues and approaches you could take, right? You could, as Sophie said, start off with education, or you could go through health, or look at reforestation and conservation, or you could be looking at media and comms, or strategic litigation, or direct action like Extinction Rebellion. There's so many different paths, and the reality is they're all underfunded and they're all really important. And so I think, you know, for me personally, it's about helping people find something that they're really passionate about, because that will increase their likelihood of giving over a longer period of time, rather than a one-off, okay, you've told me that blue carbon is where it's at, I'm going to give a grant to blue carbon this year and then never again. And what we really need is more long-term funders in this space who can sort of commit over several years. And so I think everyone will have different areas of interest, whether that's based on what they've traditionally funded, personal experience, what sort of impacts they're looking to have as a funder. And I think it's really exploring that and going on a bit of a journey. I think if I had to like name where, well, if I had to name what's underfunded in a already underfunded space, natural climate solutions are said to be contributes, I think, is it 37% or something under 50% of climate mitigation solutions, yet receive only 3% of that already 2% funding. I also think thinking about who and where you're funding. So of that 3%, of that 2% of funding, of total philanthropic funding that goes into climate philanthropy, only 1.3% goes into supporting organizations that are run by people of color. We in Patients Earth really like to focus attention to organizations that are working on issues of climate justice, and organizations that are working in the global south, because they are even more underfunded than organizations working in the global north. So if you're following it through a lens of sort of who and where, those would be the areas I would say would be, you know, the most underfunded / most impactful. But I'll hand over to Sophie, because I think she'll have some opinions on that too.
I definitely agree with Jude about the approach to take at Patients Earth, which is to follow what you're interested in, because ultimately that's where you'll get passionate about it, or you'll continue, you'll learn, and then you'll do more, and then you'll learn where the levers for change are, and that's really important. So I'd say it's often down to the philanthropist as much as down to the actual sector that you're the part within the climate sector that you're funding in. But I think what is quite interesting is that you know, as human beings, we sort of have certain campaigns that really sort of seem to take our which we seem to sort of really follow, like plastics. Like, you know, it's really important, the plastics. And then someone I work with at Patients Earth, Joaquin, he was talking to me about the, you know, the oceans, and he was saying, yeah, the plastics are important, it's important, but actually the oceans, you know, they have an incredible way of regenerating. So if you allow them to regenerate, that you're going to get so much more money, you know, it's bang for your buck doing that instead of the plastics. But people would come in as a philanthropist going, but I've got to clear the plastics, because it's something that we have about clearing rubbish and getting that out. And so I think it's coming in where you have interest, but then make sure once you're in there, actually where can you have that impact? And that really is down to listening, down to finding what other people are doing, and really taking it upon yourself to, you know, to learn, actually.
Thank you. Thanks both. Thank you both. So
yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think it takes a lot of humility to be a climate philanthropist, because it really is. And we say this all the time, like, we're learning alongside a lot of the donors that we work with, you know, that there's so much out there, and there's so many amazing people doing incredible work to learn from. And so I think it really does take an ability to step back and be a learner rather than an educator in this space, if you're a climate philanthropist.
Thank you. So, I mean, you've talked a bit about impactful philanthropy, and of course, philanthropists have to be confident about where they put their money. But Jamie, going back to the other side of the equation, how confident can investors be in relation to the environment credentials of ESG funds? Because we've seen of late Tarek Anthony, who, for those of you who don't know, is the former head of sustainable investing of BlackRock, say some quite damning stuff about ESG, and the FCA issued a letter recently to authorize fund managers expressing some unhappiness about how ESG claims have been overstated and may mislead. So what can be done to displace that concern about greenwashing? Is there a scandal waiting in the wings on this?
Well, Jonathan, will you let me comment on the previous conversation? Because I just...
That would be too easy. No. Please go for it, Jamie, go on.
I think the market can, you know, market capital can fund certain things. and it can't fund certain other things. So market capital can do a lot of funding in renewable energy and natural capital. And, it's amazing how much scope there is to move capital, market capital into these spaces. But there are things that market capital cannot do. And one of them, generally speaking, is political advocacy. So I like to think of philanthropic capital, philanthropy money, and market capital doing very different things, because some of the biggest stuff can be done. You can move billions into environmental solutions, but you can't move large amounts of money. I mean, Sophie was describing funding Extinction Rebellion. There's no way to get market capital to fund somebody like Extinction Rebellion, and a lot of the political advocacy, or the stuff that Tessa does in litigation, climate litigation, that's really hard to fund. And so I just think that people should think about the kind of leverage they have in funding things that nobody else is going to fund. That's a good place to start, I would say. To actually answer your question, I think if I think in terms of solutions, I don't really think, I make a distinction between investment that's aligned with people's values and investment that creates solutions. And I think we think of solutions as having an impact. That's what impact investing. Sustainable investing is more, and that's largely what people mean when they say ESG investing, is largely about aligning your investment with your values. But I would contest whether they're actually contributing to solutions. And the FCA paper that you cite, which is actually a very, very good paper, distinguishes between the kind of investing that creates solutions and the kind of investing that's values aligned. I mean, it's a very good paper, and I think I've said to people, certainly of the asset management industry, they should be reading this really, really carefully. But I think if you want to solve problems, you're going to have to it's going to have to be additional. It's going to have to be additive. And so I think Tarek Fancy, the BlackRock whistleblower, was effectively saying ESG investing, sustainable investing, generally speaking, doesn't actually do much in terms of providing solutions. And aside from the fact that it's badly done now, which I don't disagree with, even if it were done really, really well, it still wouldn't be delivering capital into, renewable solutions and climate solutions. So, I think the question of should we clean up ESG and be clearer about what we're doing and stop confusing people and misleading people? Absolutely. But even if we did that, you wouldn't be seeing billions and trillions going into renewable energy or going into building a natural capital. And I think the really important thing is to distinguish between the kind of investing that is sustainable and values aligned versus the kind of investing that actually puts capital into the solutions that we need to reduce CO2 emissions.
Thank you. I think that's all points well made, that people have to be as thoughtful with their investments in terms of what they're trying to achieve as they are with their philanthropy. Tessa, can I turn back to you as you touched on right at the start, when you were talking about, we've seen governments push forward policies, but they're not being implemented in a way which will meet the timescale necessary to get to carbon zero. Climate litigation has proven to be one of the most powerful tools available to hold government and big business to account. Could you just provide a flavour of the types of litigation that is being brought in relation to climate, and perhaps highlight those cases which have successfully course-corrected governments and big business?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's been a real surge in the last 5 or 6 years in climate cases that have, what I would describe as sort of systemic ambition. So it's not just going after one coal-fired power plant or, one airport runway, but it's really challenging a government's whole of economy approach to climate change mitigation, or it's challenging a fossil fuel company's entire scope of emissions. And in that respect, biased because I've been involved in this case, but the case against the Dutch government brought by the Agenda Foundation, which was initially successful in 2015 and then was upheld on appeal subsequently over a number of years, was the first case in the world in which a court ordered a national government to reduce a country's greenhouse gas emissions by an absolute minimum amount. And that set a global precedent. It has inspired cases, and that's why we set up the Climate Litigation Network to support these cases, but against governments around the world. And just this year alone, there have been successful cases in superior courts in France, Germany, and Belgium. And in Germany, we know that led directly to the German government increasing the ambition of its 2030 emissions reduction target to 65%. So I think there's no question that these cases are a really powerful tool, as you said. On the corporate accountability side, it's a more challenging space, but there's just as much momentum in terms of the creativity and the volume of litigation that's being developed. I think one of the most interesting cases in that space has been a case that was brought against a German utility company, the biggest German energy company, RWE, by a farmer in Peru, whose village in the Peruvian Andes is at risk of glacial melt from the melting glaciers in the Andes. And he's quantified the proportion of emissions that RWE has contributed to the current level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and he's asking RWE to pay damages in proportion to that contribution, which of course is a nominal amount. It's about €20,000. But the point is the principle that it would establish, which is liability on the part of fossil fuel companies for the damage that they are now causing as a result of their historical contributions to climate change. And within the German court system, they've accepted in principle that liability exists, and they've moved to the evidentiary phase of that case. So that's really exciting. And of course, in May this year, again, in a Dutch court, there was a case against Shell, which also used a similar argument to the one against the Dutch government, which was sort of based on principles of tort law under Dutch civil law to establish that Shell has a duty to reduce its entire scope of emissions, so from both operational all the way down to combustion and use emissions by about 45% by 2030. And the sort of implementation of that judgment is yet to be fully explored, but it's a hugely important precedent to have set. So I think this is just a tactic that will become increasingly pervasive and successful, given the evidence is increasingly on our side.
Are we seeing these cases sort of mushroom in different jurisdictions? I mean, are they gathering pace and being brought under different banners? So it's not necessarily purely, a tort case, but being brought under different heads, using basically all the tools in the box available to litigators to bring these cases.
Yeah, definitely, under all different causes of action. So human rights, administrative, constitutional, tort, corporate law, all bodies of law are sort of being drawn on. And I think the one thing that these cases all tend to have in common, which is what makes them so replicable across jurisdiction, are the facts, the facts of climate change, the facts of attribution of certain kinds of harm to climate change. And it's now, of course, much easier to trace the contribution that countries and companies have made to, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So all of those tools are becoming increasingly refined.
And in terms of Jamie's point about philanthropy, is it philanthropy that's funding these cases being brought? Is that who is funding the litigation? Yeah,
I mean, I think certainly certainly in my experience, the cases that I've worked on, philanthropic funding was key. In a number of jurisdictions, depending on the kind of culture of legal practice, you may get pro bono lawyers working pro bono, but inevitably there are other fees involved. And just, I think, as importantly as the legal dimension, in my view, for these cases to be successful, you need a really well thought out communication strategy and campaign strategy. And that, of course, all requires funding. And I think that funders are increasingly aware of the different ways in which they can offset the costs of litigation, even if that's helping to indemnify you against an adverse costs order if you lose litigation. But that's, those are, and often those costs aren't huge, but philanthropy absolutely does have a role to play in those cases.
Thank you. I don't see anything in the Q&A, so I'm going to exercise my prerogative to ask a question that I didn't think I was going to have time to ask Jamie earlier, because you were talking about solution-driven investments. And just so people who are listening have an idea of what those look like, could you give a couple of examples of things that you've seen?
Just in the category of solutions, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think, everybody knows about wind and solar, but I think you can expand that whole thing and start to think about adjacent areas like batteries and storage and transmission and smart metering and energy efficiency and retrofit and that kind of thing. So, and then you can go into carbon capture and hydrogen solutions if you want. So I think there's a whole area that's adjacent to the very, very standard conventional wind and solar. But I also think and I think we've said this earlier, that climate touches everything. So you can also invest in climate through natural capital. So you can invest in, sustainable forestry is kind of straightforward, but there's sustainable fisheries, there's sustainable agriculture. Most of ag tech is going to look a little bit like husbanding resources more effectively. So you can invest in ecosystem restoration, and a lot of that stuff actually ends up supporting local communities. So certainly in sustainable agriculture and landscape or ecosystem restoration, you end up involving the communities around them. So it's not just a climate investment, but also an investment that affects people and people's lives and the communities they live in. So I think there are a lot of very conventional kinds of investments. People do this all the time, and they're available now for charity endowments. You just have to look for them. And I agree with Sophie, it's not easy to do, but there are people doing it today. There are endowments doing it today, and you just need to look at them, whether it's Esme Fairbairn or Friends Provident or Church Commissioners. Just look at what they're doing, because there's some really good ideas already out there implemented. And I just think it's a very exciting area. There's lots of ways to make your investments work toward climate.
And are these concessionary investments where you're taking a view on returns?
No, not usually. You can make them concessionary if you want to, or you can combine them with some of your grant activity, but they don't have to be concessionary if you need them not to be.
Because I think, again, that often gets lost in the mix when trustees are thinking about these questions. So thank you. I think as we're drawing to a close, I'll just ask a final question to each of you, because as it is easy to be fatalistic about this issue, what piece of advice would you give those people who have been listening today about what they should take away, what thing should be on their to-do list, either as a charity or as an intermediary? Anybody can pitch in.
I don't want to take the words out of Sophie's mouth, because I think this is what she's going to say. Just do something. Just start. Get on that bike, and if you fall off, that's fine. But I think we have this tendency to want to build like this perfect climate philanthropy strategy and assess all the options before we decide what approach to take or where's going to have the most impact. And there is no time like the present, and it's really about getting started. And I was on another panel earlier today, which was about youth engagement in climate action. And there are so many young people around the world who are going to inherit the problems of today tomorrow, and who have contributed to the climate crisis the least, who are so frustrated by their feeling of lack of ability to do anything. And we talk about eco-anxiety and the rise of eco-anxiety, and it actually not being a result of the fear of the climate crisis, but rather the fact that these young people can't take action or have agency to take action. And I think anyone who is sitting in a position of privilege and power because they have financial capital, whether it's through grant making or through investment decisions, to really put that to good use in terms of climate solutions. Like, I think just think about all those people out there who don't have that ability to use their money in that way. And I think hopefully that can motivate you to think about how you can be contributing towards climate solutions.
That was exactly what I was going to say, but then instead I'm going to say something else. It's really important to keep the hope. It really is so important, because as soon as you get fatalistic, it's like, oh, it's going to happen anyway. And to be fair, that is something that many who favour the status quo want us to believe, that actually, no, we can't do anything, so just don't do anything. And I'm just going to say that, as a philanthropist, this sector is incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And, I have met the funders that are there, the people who are working in it, the organizations that are so committed. I mean, I have not seen this in anything else I've ever worked in. And so, it's a bit like, come in if the water is warm. It's great. There is so much. If you're in this and doing it, you are with the hope. You're not with the fatalistic side, you're with the hope. And that's where that's where you want to be. So, get in.
Tessa, Jamie?
Yeah, it's hard to really add anything of value to what's already been said. I guess, on hope, it's a bit of a cliche, but, action is kind of what generates hope, actually. It's not a passive, it's not something that you can create when you're passive. And I feel hopeful every day, and that's because I'm working alongside and within this incredibly vibrant movement and collective of brilliant people who are committed to this problem. And I guess the other reason that I feel confident about what we're doing is that we do actually know exactly what needs to be done, right? We know exactly who and what needs to change. And that's a gift. And we've also, at least in the UK, we've got a public that's willing us to succeed. So the conditions are in a lot of ways really favorable for us to succeed. And, I think that's something that's worth bearing in mind.
Thank you.
And you'd expect me, Jonathan, to say that you should deploy your endowment assets in more constructive ways. But I think the thing that really struck me, and I think it was Juju who said that climate touches, no matter what you do as a charity, climate touches you. Climate touches every aspect of our lives now. And so no matter, you don't have to be a climate charity for this to matter to you. And the work that you're doing today is going to be impacted by charity. So I think doing your existing work with a lens on where climate is going, I think is a tremendously productive way to approach this. Juju, that wasn't it?
Yeah, and I 100% agree.
Sorry to plagiarize, but I thought I'd give you a little tribute to so wise and just fantastic advice.
Well, that's a good note to end on. I mean, plenty to be worried about, clearly, plenty to be inspired by. But I think the big picture point that I'm taking away is that people need to engage now to match the urgency of the moment. So thank you all. I do hope people who've been watching enjoyed the session, found it useful. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. I think we can probably hear the sound of psychic applause coming down through the Wi-Fi, but I'm afraid that's all we can offer. So thank you very much for participating, and thanks everyone for tuning in, and we will see everyone next time. So thanks again.